Hi, and welcome back with me, your host, Dr. Oscar Hernandez, board-certified internist and practicing pediatrician. Today, folks, we are going to unmask the medical history of pandemics and epidemics. And there have been about 6 worldwide pandemics that we can glean information on and reflect on these pandemics and see how they apply to the COVID-19 epidemic of today. If you don't know who Justinian was and the plague of Constantinople, not to mention a couple of other ugly things that we're going to look at, some of them originating in China. Everything old is new again? Back to the Future? Come back soon. We're going to talk more about plagues in the history of mankind. So we're back. We're going to do a history of medicine today as it relates to COVID-19 and as it relates to other pandemics. And no, for those of you who are of my generation, this isn't Monty Python's History of the World. We're going to be talking about stuff that's a little bit more serious. We're going to start with a friendly little Roman emperor named Justinian. And back in the day of Justinian, this is about 541 BC, the Roman Empire was divided into the Western Roman Empire and the Eastern Roman Empire. Justinian thought that it would be a good idea to bridge these two empires back and bring them together. He did that for a very short period of time, but a little something called the plague ruined his economy. And his armies, the Byzantine army, was kind of stranded and underfunded, and a little group of people decided to come in and break up his ideas for joining the two empires, and these were known as the Lombards. So if you've heard of the Lombardy region of Italy, that's the area where the Lombards prospered, and they prospered so well because Justinian's armies were underfunded. Why were they underfunded? Because Justinian drew much of his income from farmers. And guess what was happening to a lot of his farmers? They were dying. I wonder why they were dying. Have you ever heard of something called Yersinia pestis? If you didn't before, you heard it today. This is the bacteria that causes the plague. You've probably heard of plague, and plague has been seen through the history of mankind in different incarnations. There was the plague of London, the Black Plague. We're going to talk a little bit about those. But this is the plague of Justinian, the first documented pandemic in the history of the world. Why did it come to an end? Because it pretty much killed everybody it came in contact with, and there were just not a whole lot more people to kill. Procopius is an old historian from the Byzantine era, and he was saying that as many as 10,000 people a day were dying in Constantinople, and that there were no burial rites, and that the bodies were just stacked up on the street. About a third of the population of the city was wiped out. This was terrible. Guess where Yersinia pestis originated? Well, the same place that we're seeing plague today. The areas of Mongolia, Kazakhstan, Western China. Does that ring a bell? We believe that these fleas that were carried on rats and mice worked themselves down to ports of the area, boarded ships, made it to Egypt, and much of the grain that Constantinople got was imported through ships from Egypt, from the port of Alexandria. These rats decided that Constantinople looked like a nice place to live, and they carried the fleas with them. Off the ship they came, and Ratatouille style, and they wound up causing the plague of Justinian. A lot of dead people. 541 BC, the first documented pandemic plague. It rears up its ugly head again in the 1400s. It comes in the way of what we call the Black Plague. The Black Plague was exactly the same thing, Yersinia pestis, and it came in 2 flavors at that time. There was bubonic plague, which caused these big lumps and black balls and boils on the skin of people, and pneumonic plague. Pneumonic plague affected mostly the lungs. Does COVID-19 ring a bell? Back to the Future. So everything old is new again. Again, a pulmonary illness. And so the Black Plague ravaged much of Europe, and it came in waves. Finally, there was a little something called quarantine invented. Now, ships arriving from Venice into the ports in southern Europe had been bringing in these same rats with the Yersinia pestis and plague and so on. And so the idea came that these ships would be held at bay, at anchor, for 40 days. The word for 40 in Italian is 40, the word from which we got our idea of quarantine. So for 40 days, these ships would be held at bay, or people who were thought to be infected were held at bay. They didn't have symptoms. They could come out of the port. They could go and be among people. So finally, this concept of quarantine came into play. Does the idea of social isolation, and not social distancing, a different thing, but social isolation, which worked very, very well in the beginning of the pandemic, of the COVID-19 pandemic, to decrease our numbers nationally, that still works, folks. So, as we look at some of the things that we are doing now to contain COVID-19, in terms of prevention, I'm not talking about hospitalization and plasma transfusions and remdesivir and things that obviously did not exist in the 1400s. But the basic things about social distancing and isolation, these things are very important. Now, people use the words quarantine and isolation simultaneously. They're not the same thing, and there is a difference. Then we come to the idea of the Plague of London. Now, the Brits had a little trouble learning the lessons from the Plague of the 1400s. The Plague of London is the same thing, Yersinia pestis. This keeps coming up over and over history. Where did this originate? Kazakhstan, Western China, made its way down, and continued to be a problem. Why do I bring up the idea that the same thing has been a problem over and over through the history of mankind? If you think that we have one wave of COVID, and now probably we're in the middle of another wave of COVID, politicians might say this or that. In Miami, where I'm at, we're in the middle of another wave of COVID. By the way, inflicted not by the politicians, but inflicted by you. Well, maybe not you, but somebody that is out there in the listening audience, because we neglect to put these on when we're supposed to put them on. We neglect to use this. By the way, these two little props have been with me, and I've shown them over and over on different videos over the past 6 months since we've been dealing with this here in Miami. This is still our number one defense against COVID. The other thing that's the number one defense against COVID is 2 arm lengths, right? We want to stay 2 arm lengths away from people, especially if they're not our family or people that we're dealing with all the time who haven't had symptoms. All right, so again, it's the idea of repetition. So we've had repeated plagues from Yersinia pestis. Expect repeated waves from COVID-19. Even if we have a vaccine, it's going to happen. Why? Because the vaccine won't be 100%. If we have a vaccine that's 70% effective, we'll be in good shape. Let's go back to the Plague of London. These Brits just didn't learn. The Plague of London kept coming every 20, 30 years, and it showed up between 1300 and the 1600s. These folks just didn't get it, that plague was something that had to do with rats, with fleas, that the concepts of quarantine still applied and worked well. Well, so the Plague of London, the Black Death. Then, in the 1700s, we come into the concept of smallpox. A viral, now we're getting into a viral pandemic, and smallpox is a virus. And fortunately, by the end of the 1700s, it's almost totally wiped out thanks to the concept of vaccinations. So the vaccines, and I've explained this on a previous video, were developed by a physician who actually helped vaccinate the Continental Army while it was in its winter camp at Valley Forge. And what they did was, this guy was really smart. He took a little quill, and he took the tip of the quill, and he poked somebody's smallpox lesion. And then he inoculated, actually the first time he inoculated this, I believe was in a Dutch boy. And he inoculated him with smallpox. This would have been unthinkable, right? Well, the boy developed antibodies and never really got any serious case of smallpox. The same concept was applied to the Continental Army that was being ravaged by smallpox. So there you go. Then we work our way up into the 1800s, the time of the Civil War in the American nation. And guess what was killing more soldiers than the Civil War, especially Confederate soldiers? Cholera, diarrhea. They were dehydrating. So cholera is a bacterial illness. And so little by little, we figured out that sanitation was the way to contain cholera, right? So if the soldiers were wiping themselves or relieving themselves in a place where other soldiers would come, they would relieve themselves, they would touch themselves, and this was just a fecal oral, hand to mouth, shake my buddy's hand, touch his rifle, he then touched his rifle. What does this remind us of? Surface sanitation when it comes to COVID-19. The importance of the fact that touch transmission and the cleansing of touch surfaces. Don't go clean your ceiling and your rug and sanitize them for COVID. That's not where we're going with this. We want hand sanitation. Everything old is new again. Then we come to a little something called the Spanish flu. Now, the Spanish flu did not originate in Spain. The reason it's called the Spanish flu is that the newspapers in Madrid in May of 1918 started to report that the king had this illness that was already known in other parts of Europe. We don't know exactly where the Spanish flu originated. It did not originate in Spain, and we're not going to blame the Chinese for this one. But it started somewhere, probably around Turkey. And the armies and nations during the time of World War I did not want to tell anybody that their nations, their armies, were being ravaged by the Spanish flu, which was highly contagious and highly deadly. And so they wouldn't talk about it. But the Spaniards were not involved in World War I, nor were they involved in World War II. They were involved in their own civil war, which was very bloody in the 1930s. My grandfather died in that war. He was fighting for the wrong side, for the Republic. It sounds good, the Republic, right? Because we think of Star Wars and the Republic of the United States and all these things. Well, the Republic was basically a bunch of communists, so he was fighting for the wrong side. Anyway, that's my own personal history. Let's get back to the Spanish flu. So the Spanish flu started to ravage armies and nations throughout Europe. How many people did it kill? Well, a lot of the American soldiers that were overseas did not die on the battlefield, and believe me, many of them died on the battlefield. It was bloody war, World War I. Most of them died of what? Spanish flu. And when they came back to America, what did they bring? Spanish flu. And there are reports of about 15,000 people dying in the city of Philadelphia between September of 1918 and March of 1919. So this was an absolutely ravaging illness. How many people were affected in time by Spanish flu? Well, worldwide, between 50 and 100 million dead people. In the United States, we had about 675,000 deaths, and 500 million people were infected worldwide. Where did it originate? We're not really sure. Maybe somewhere around Turkey. All right, so by the way, the Spanish flu was a flu. It was a viral illness. It was the H1N1 viral illness. In 1957, we had another pandemic of flu, the H2N2 flu. In 1963, we had another outbreak of flu, H3N2. In 2009, we had H1N1. Where did many of these viruses originate? I'm not going to tell you, but you can guess. All right, folks, here's the deal. Sometimes we, as people who live in a free society, who do not like to be told what to do, will say that we do not want to wear masks because it is a point of personal preference, that it is a point of liberty and freedom. Forget that stupid argument. The government tells you that you have to wear clothes and you can't walk around naked. Is walking around naked a point of personal freedom? No. The government tells you that you cannot smoke in elevators or in restaurants or in certain public places. Why? Because the smoke intoxicates other people and they get secondhand smoke and it can be very bad for them. Are we going to wait for the government to tell us that we must wear this or we're going to be fined or go to jail? Don't let it happen. I've got something more important and of greater authority that you can bank on when it comes to doing this little thing. And it has to do with an instruction given over 2,000 years ago. Yes, over 2,000 years ago. We're even going earlier than the plague of Justinian now. And these instructions were given to people by my boss. My boss is Jesus Christ. And in Mark, and in Luke, and in Matthew, there is a scene where Jesus is asked, what is the greatest commandment? And he answers with commandment 1 from the Jewish Old Testament that can be found in Exodus and Deuteronomy. And he says, O Israel, the Lord thy God is one. You will love the Lord thy God with all your heart, mind, and soul. By the way, does that remind you of the sign of the cross? the mind, the heart, and the soul. Anyway, so he adds to it a second commandment, which is something only God can do, right? He says, you love your brother as yourself. If you love your brother as yourself, you're not going to expose them to COVID. Oh, doctor, I don't have COVID. I don't need to wear this. We think that about 40% of transmission is by asymptomatic people. You don't know whether you have it or not unless you're tested. And we can't test everybody. If you're in public, if you're more than 6 feet away from people, you don't need to wear a mask. That's my opinion, and that's CDC criteria. I can quote you chapter and verse. If you're in public and you're less than 6 feet away from someone, wear a mask. That cloth thing that you wear on your face out there, that's probably not going to help you too much. If you're going to be in contact with other people less than 6 feet apart for more than 10 minutes, please wear a mask. That cloth thing doesn't work. Get one of these, an N95, at least a surgical mask. Why an N95? I've said it before, I'll say it again just to refresh your memory. It is the only mask that protects you from COVID-19. All the other devices are useful to protect other people from COVID-19. Well, wear that if you have nothing else because you do want to protect your brother. But hey, you also want to protect yourself. So we unmasked at the beginning of the program, and now I'm encouraging you to remask when you're in the proper settings. Folks, that's all we have today for you. We'll come back with another video soon. I hope that this little walk through the history of medicine has refreshed your memory, because I'm sure that all of you were students of the history of medicine and knew all these things. But if you didn't, we taught you today. So you learned something new. Give us a thumbs up if you like the program. Please subscribe. If you don't subscribe, you don't get this stuff. So if you're a first-time viewer, just, go downstairs, do whatever you got to do. And if you have any comments, send us your comments. I truly, truly try to answer all of them. All right, thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.